hopefully my internet will hold up with this. But yeah, thanks very much for having us. It's been a really lovely conference so far. My name's Morel O'Sullivan and I'm here to present Star-Crossed Others, from the queer aesthetics of space travel film to contemporary queer world building. Now, I'm not currently pursuing this in any formal academic sense. It's really more of a passion project, but something I might like to pursue in the future. And it's really more the beginnings of something than whatever an end might look like. But I just really thought I'd like to share it with people and see what people think. So, outer space films, queer world building, what do they have to do with each other, and indeed anything? Hopefully that's what we're here to find out. I'm going to start off with a bit of anecdotal introduction, and then we'll find out where this paper is going. Fully automated luxury gay space communism. This is a meme that emerged in digital leftist spaces post-2014. It came about as a semi-ironic exaggeration of Aaron Bastani's already pretty provocative theory of fully automated luxury communism, published on YouTube that year, now a book by Verso. Fully automated luxury communism imagines using automated technology to reduce the need for human labour, but rather than increasing profits, this is meant to reduce the working week and ensure people's needs are met. The fully automated luxury gay space communism meme takes this and relocates it within a post-heteronormative society, and of course in space. So how is it used? It tends to be used in a way that sort of like mocks moderate notions of progress. So you might say like, oh, a clap for the NHS. I think I'll have fully automated luxury gay space communism. Thank you very much. So the tone is pretty interesting because it quite like frankly demands an end to heteronormativity, end to capitalism, but it might all just be a joke. It's self-assured but literally self-parodying. It treads a familiar line between calling for something frustratingly sort of possible and wildly out of this world. This paper is not really to debate fully automated luxury communism, but more to ask, where did gay space come from, and what does that bring into the equation? So, as a pretty intense fan of campy old space travel films, gay space felt sort of oddly familiar, so obviously I interpreted this as an invitation to trace the role that film might have played in producing this semi-ironic queer outer space aesthetic. So I'm going to start with a very brief history of queer outer space, before mentioning the ways in which film and space travel are very inherently intertwined, and then I'm going to look at 3 tropes from the earlier space travel films that I think contribute to a queer outer space aesthetic, before finally looking at what this might all mean for the way that we think and joke about the future. So is outer space queer? To head back to real life for a moment, when you think of space travel, you might think of the corporate, militaristic and colonising endeavours of the contemporary outer space industry, which we'll touch on later, and so a queer outer space aesthetic might seem somewhat contradictory. Yet I would pose that before space travel was possible, space travel was queer. In the 2nd century AD, Lucian of Samosata penned one of the first recorded stories about human space travel, and was the first to pose that the moon is in fact full of homosexuals. In his satirical work A True Story, the satire is that it isn't true. The protagonist is washed up to the moon on a giant wave, and he comments of the society he finds there. They are not born of women, but of men. They marry men and do not even know the word for woman at all. Up to the age of 25, each is a wife and thereafter a husband. They carry their children in the calf of their leg instead of the belly. So what do we make of that? I think we can take that outer space environments and alien characters have sort of long been a site for what Donna Haraway might call speculative fabulation, for imagining worlds and societies beyond those we live in. And interestingly, there's also this historical link between queer outer space and satire or humour. Now, this practice of using outer space to reimagine gender and sexuality has continued across a whole variety of mediums. Like, you might think especially about the novels of mid to late 20th century feminist writers such as Joanna Russ, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler. But in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on a space travel film. I'm going to be analysing tropes by drawing quite freely and fleetingly on a sort of collage of examples, mainly from early European cinema and Golden Age American sci-fi, but what they have in common is that they feature an outer space environment or an alien character. But why film in the first place? I think first on a basic level, these films are what I know about. It was through like just watching these films for fun that I sort of started to notice these themes, but I think there is a lot more to it than that, in that whether intentional or otherwise, as a visual medium, film has great potential for creating aesthetics. And maybe more so than novels or even comics, film often poses to imagine on our behalf, which is always interesting, noting that the means of film production have spent the majority of their existence in the hands of affluent white men. And lastly, I feel that film, space and travel have an intrinsic relationship. From its earliest years, film has always been about the illusion of movement, and as Tom Gunning would tell you, film, much like space travel a few decades later, was all about the spectacle of technology. As a result of this, early film was obsessed with transport and travel. If you study early film, you'll have seen a lot of films about trains and trams, which came about both to showcase the possibilities of new film technologies and, as Anna Lopez discusses, to showcase the modernity and progress of a nation through displaying its transport infrastructure. But further to this, film itself offers the possibility of delocalization, taking you visually to a place that you aren't in. This is really epitomised by the 1904 Hills Tour of the World attraction, which allowed you to view films with rolling landscapes while seated in a stationary train carriage, harnessing these two technologies of movement, the illusion of travel, and this joy of delocalization. And so, even in film's earliest obsessive focus with capturing ever-changing reality, film has always and consequently been about the impossible. So as both a technological and imaginative endeavour, film has been drawn to space travel for almost as long as it has existed. So with this established, I'm going to outline 3 space travel film tropes that I think contribute to an outer space aesthetic. First is scary, sexy aliens. When we think of early film, we probably think of George Méliès's 1902 Voyage dans la Lune, Trip to the Moon, inspired by the sci-fi stories of Jules Verne. Méliès actually made quite a few space films, which were popularly imitated and remade internationally. And in these films, space is mostly a setting to try out the new illusions of film editing. It's a place of fantastical and frightening wonders, and often a markedly sensual space. Like you can see in here, the moon and the sun are trying to get it off with each other. The stars, as we'll come to establish, are full of sexy women. However, with the rise of Russian cosmism and the serious scientific study of rocketry, also inspired somewhat by the writings of Jules Verne, by the golden age in the 50s, space travel films had become gradually more concerned, not with the sensuous wonders of space, but with men's relationship with technology. To throw back to Lucian of Samosata, it becomes increasingly interesting because moon aliens did not know the word for women at all. In her essay, The Virginity of Astronauts, Vivian Sobchak writes that in classic space travel film, both sexuality and women fittingly constitute a major absence. And would it be a quest for this presentation if I wasn't about to read heavily into a major absence? Sobchak poses that in such films, femininity and sexuality pose a threat to the cool reason and male camaraderie necessary to the conquest of space. Cue curt military personas and tepid romantic B-plots. But I think so often, even if only on a superficial level, even the most chastely heteronormative of agendas always have the way of producing very own accidental queer aesthetics. Before we get to the aliens themselves, let's talk male camaraderie. Especially in early films, where for some reason the crew uniform is eyeliner and leather. I'm looking at you, Muscovette, 1918. You don't get away with the intense homosociality of packing a bunch of men into a tin can and shooting them into space without the odd accidental homoerotic overturn. But even later in the century, military adjacent and propaganda aesthetics make sure unintentionally that male camaraderie and the conquest of space still just has something about it. Honourable mention to this homosocial Soviet space celebration poster, which really does say gay space communism. It actually says glory to the workers of the Soviet science and technology, apparently. As for the few female astronaut characters in classic space travel film, writing 30 years ago, Sobchak laments their lack of their desexualization, citing that these women are neutralized by masculine or technical attire. But a queer reading might respond, nice. Like, of course, the intention is to paint science and technology as a stoic masculine endeavour, but what you're showing me on an aesthetic level is that space is full of dapper butchers and utility femmes, such as in Fritz Lang's Woman on the Moon. But the flip side of all this mid-century space explorer chastity, we often find challenging alien environments and alien encounters as a chaotic counter to this cool reason and male camaraderie. Space and its inhabitants come to represent everything these men weren't expecting, the unknown and unexplored, the not so easily conquered, unconquerable and threatening, but somehow always alluring. Space comes to sound a bit queer. Just as Harry M. Benshoff's Monsters in the Closet presents us a queer reading of outcast horror monsters, Sobchak gives us aliens as they're oppressed. The Alien Enemy in Forbidden Planet 1956 is a massive psychic energy literally called the monster from the id, the part of the mind that in Freudian psychoanalysis is responsible for primal urges and desires. Elsewhere, these formidable primal urges, I would add, of course, find their manifestation sexy aliens. Catwoman of the Moon, 1953, Voyage to the Planet of Prehistoric Women, 1968, and many other weirdly similar films in between give us planets populated solely by threateningly sexy women. Now, what these films try to show me is men overcoming their sexual desire and the monstrous feminine in order to conquer the farthest reaches of the universe with their smarts, technology, and of course camaraderie. But what they succeed aesthetically in showing me is that space is full of lesbian communes. You know, I feel like I'm obsessed with the publicity stills from Catwoman of the Moon. Like, I don't have to do this presentation. In the description, I guess, is an alien astronaut couple embracing, surrounded by Catwoman in leotards. That's heteronormativity, surrounded by the alluring mysteries of the universe beyond. But with this, it becomes clear, if it wasn't already, that these fears and fantasies of space exploration are pretty much just euphemisms for fears and fantasies of colonising. These stories are barely a step removed from typically fetishising colonial narratives, maybe even whitewashed rehashings of colonisers' hostile encounters with unfamiliar, inverted commas, threatening sexual and gendered practices of native populations, as explored by Afsana Najmabadi, for example. Whether under the thinnest of veils as Indigenous or migrant peoples, adjacently as queer bodies, as disabled bodies, in Tamara Kitersa's writing on aliens and anti-blackness, or in the whole of the presentation I've made on how alien characters are coded as autistic, we see that space alien encounters come to stand in for all manner of dominant cultures, hostile yet curious encounters with its own Earth. Activist aliens. A different spin on this alien othering comes in highlighting dominant culture's fear of the potential for this other to make change. Activist aliens. Space aliens have a long history of standing in for political ideologies. The first Soviet space film, Alita Queen of Mars, 1924, shows us monarchist aliens too selfish to form an intergalactic communist federation. And with the rise of the American Cold War alien paranoia genre in films such as The Blob, 1985, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, 1956, we see alien creatures violently dissolve victims' individuality until they're all the same, supposedly like under the threat of communism. And so we see fantasies of colonisation turn to fears of invasion. The other side of the same coin is what Hugh Ruppersberg calls the alien messiah narrative. Alien figures come to Earth, but with the answer to earthly problems. In Hibble's Quebec, A Trip to Mars, 1918, the aliens bring the secret to peace after the First World War. And famously, in The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1951, Klaatu arrived to warn humans against the use of the atom bomb. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's a certain trend in later films in which aliens come to Earth and seemingly improve women's sex lives. Think like David Bowie in The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976, Jeff Goldblum in Earth Girls Are Easy, 1988, perhaps just as noble an endeavour. And so we see how dominant culture both fears the other and puts its faith in the other as its salvation. Ruppersberg believes that the alien messiah narrative is rooted in a defeatist attitude, locating humanity's salvation outside of humanity itself, beyond its own power. However, what I can't help but seeing over and over again is an accidental admission from a dominant culture of the huge potentiality and change-making power it fears from its alienated people, from which I might allow myself to take a spoonful of hope. Thirdly and finally, to look at medium of a message, the queer art of bad films. I thought I'd start this segment with a very relevant tweet I came across, which reads, "Gay people are like, you don't get it, I'm obsessed, and then make you watch the worst movie you've ever seen." If it hasn't yet been made apparent, a good proportion of the films I've talked about are pretty terrible films. Especially with the mid-century B movies, I feel like a lot of this comes from the ultimate parent pie concept, low budget, which is probably a queer aesthetic in itself. This image is from the farcically bad cult favourite Plan 9 from Outer Space, 1959, queer actor Bunny Breckenridge as alien ruler whose facial expressions are in themselves queer institutions. Reading critiques of these films, you'll undoubtedly see the phrase, unintentional comedy. Whether it's working against the retrospective hilarity of future technological predictions missing the mark, the betrayal of bluffed science or budget sets, science fiction is famed nevertheless for its capacity to take itself so incredibly seriously. But when films are founded on the impossible, I think sometimes it takes a bad film to say something about the real. I feel there's something comfortingly relatable, maybe as a queer person, maybe as an artistic person, or maybe just as any person under capitalism, about seeing characters attempting to take themselves seriously in utterly nonsensical environments in which the strings holding everything up are quite clearly visible. In these gaps in production, in these future predictions disproven, what we see caught on film is people imagining. But at the same time, the level of self-seriousness classic sci-fi exudes, along with the utter narrowness of who actually got to do that imagining, is simply an invitation for parody. And I feel it's often in these later parodies where the lid is really opened on the queerness covert in the earlier films. Of course, Rocky Horror Picture Show 1975, which directly references a whole host of sci-fi space travel B-movies in its opening song, gives us an incredibly influential camp DIY aesthetic, a host of alien misadventures on a ship of the alien from the planet Transsexual. And then in 2011, Madeleine Alneck's film, comedy, Codependent Lesbian Space Aliens Seek Same, a very wonderful film, really runs with both the idea of an entirely lesbian planet and the aesthetic of spaceships, which are obviously and irreverently made of tinfoil. Oops. In recycling the past to recenter its queerness, the camp and chaotic response of these films to those they parody reminds me of the dynamic of the fully automated luxury gay space communism meme. To look upon moderation and to half jibe, is that all you're asking for? Was that the best you could dream? To return again very briefly to real life. If space travel was queer before it was possible, then what is there to say about space travel's increasing possibility? Specifically, as Michael P. Reagan explores in terms of humanity's relative disengagement from real-world space travel issues, its increasing possibility in the hands of a few billionaires in the US Space Force. If we're talking calls towards queer imaginative interventions in or indeed against space travel, it feels relevant to bring up the fact that the History Channel have already prototyped a sex spacesuit, and this is what it looks like. The two-suit is covered in Velcro and described as one small step for humankind colonising the universe. As much as we see outer space as an enduring site of speculative population, a site of humour and ignorance, we see just as easily it's a site of the unsubtle restaging of earthly power imbalances. If classic space travel sci-fi shows me anything, it's the seductive, disruptive and destructive power a dominant culture fears from its increasingly alienated others. And whilst they may repeatedly imagine on our behalves their heroes triumphing in their resistance to ideological invasion, it wouldn't be the first plot point in a sci-fi B-movie to be utterly unconvincing. A queer outer space aesthetic offers a chance to acknowledge absurdity head-on, the power to laugh at those who posed to imagine for us and so often failed, to refuse to unsee the strings on the spaceship. In a world where sci-fi really can shape what futures we imagine, and internet humour can certainly offer a gateway into increasingly radical politics, I think what these films offer, at the very least, is an open invitation to take our turn and make our own god-awful art about the future. Thank you very much.